name's Dr. Matthew Gamble, D-Min, not to be confused with the medical doctor. Feels important. Welcome back to an installation for the Psychedelic Scene podcast, Psychedelic Scene Magazine podcast. And I have with me today a dear friend, a person I consider a brother, getting to know on the journey, Cody Gibbons. He's coming to us from LA-ish area. Bel Air, did you say, Cody?
Yep.
But Hales is stationed in both Oakland and then Barcelona, Spain. Spends quite a bit of time there, diving into some writing, and we may get into some of that today. I'm extremely excited because my first guest was Jason, who's the founder of Psychedelic Scene magazine, and then Cody is my first official guest. So it's really a pleasure to have you here today, Cody, and stoked to see what we will get into and unpack today. And so to get us rolling, my friend, you've had quite the background in life. From my perspective, you've accomplished quite a bit. I don't even know your exact age, but I'm guessing in the early 30s.
Yep, correct. 31.
31. So not even quite the age of Jesus when he perished. So, but you are right at the beginning of his age, when his ministry really got cracking. Didn't mean to necessarily go there into the Jesus realm, but here we are.
Fine by
And
me.
s- and so, yeah, tell us a little bit about yourself, your upbringing, and I mean, I'm especially intrigued, seeing as this is Psychedelic Scene magazine. Especially intrigued with your how you found yourself getting into psychedelics and where that all birthed in your life.
Sure, yeah. Um, I think my interest primarily catalyzed due to cannabis. Um, uh, when I was, well, honestly, cannabis and salvia, funny enough. Um, Salvia was a little bit more disconcerting, so it wasn't as, it was certainly fascinating. So it led to a fascination with consciousness. Um, I tried it around my 17th birthday, and previous to this had always been a uh, you know anti-drug kid, if you will. I would say the year previous, I had a friend who was a little bit older and liked to do a lot of independent research, armchair research, if you will, um, on cannabinoids and safety profiles of things, and he would educate me a bit to the point that I started to ask questions. And he really sold me because of this idea that the brain has receptors that are specifically made for cannabinoids. Um, which, I did some initial research myself and kind of came to the same conclusion, which is, a false conclusion. The receptors are not just for cannabinoids, or not just for exogenous cannabinoids, I should say, ones coming from outside the body. So, it was a bit of a misconception, but regardless, I was fascinated, and so I tried it, and it altered specific dimensions of my conscious experience that I didn't realize were alterable or malleable in any sense. So I had kind of a rigid understanding of what my conscious experience could be, and it really, blew open the doors of my imagination on what is going on here, and can these mechanisms of psychoactivity be engineered, essentially, right? If there are different experiences that come from these different strains of the plant, um, it kind of implies that you could deduce eventually where the different effects come from. So this was, an early fascination, nothing that I really had the capability of diving into seriously yet, just considering I was 17 and not quite as educated. Um, so I went into college for biochemistry and asked my professors if they could teach me about cannabinoids. Um, and none of them knew anything about cannabinoids. So they were
Hmm.
like, no. uh, some of them were like, well, it's illegal and it's, I can't really be teaching students about cannabinoids. This was back when the medical program was first initiated in Arizona. Um, so things were still controversial, like politically around the substance. Um, and still a little bit are in the academic field, but it's way better than it was then. But anyways, I got tired of learning about things that I didn't really care that much about. Right, I was not very atypical. I dropped out of college eventually because I found what I thought was a better opportunity, and I still to this day believe it was a better opportunity. And that was just firsthand real world experience with very intelligent teachers, mentors, right? So I left college because I had this mentor who was a triple PhD, and
Oh my
did,
God.
yeah, created a notable pharmaceutical company that specialized in cannabinoids, right? So I worked in the lab a bit with him, and I was learning everything that I wanted to learn. So, and I've always been fairly autodidactic. So, if I'm in an environment that I'm extremely interested in, I'll generally absorb things like a sponge. And I find this is the case with most people, really. It's just sometimes difficult finding where that niche is. Um, but yeah, I've found a way to kind of stay in niches that are extremely interesting to me. So I've been able
So,
to go ahead.
sorry, we'll finish that. I've been able to.
I've just been able to advance a lot in a research career without an academic, without a degree, if you will. So I went into like private research and stuff, and had a notable career there. But feel free to ask your
Yeah,
question.
can you circle back? So, couple questions. One is can you explain for the audience salvia? Um,
Sure.
and then two is so your psychedelic experience, which I do see, I categorize cannabis myself in the entheogenic category. But was it only cannabis and salvia that you were working with from 17 into your maybe early 20s?
No, certainly not. Also, mushrooms were my first major serotonergic psychedelic. And those, I mean, certainly, expanded my fascination quite a bit. Um, I started to try those when I was 18. Um, and by my 19th birthday, had done a 15-gram experience that I had worked up to over the course of a few months. Taking a dose like once a month and then increasing it by a certain factor. And had a notable out of body experience there, which again expanded my fascinations. And
Hmm.
yeah, did lots of exploration on top of that. Not too much longer later, 19 and a half or something, tried LSD and so on and so forth. Continued experimenting.
Wow. I've never, that's incredible, the 15 gram. There are going to be a lot of rabbit holes we could go down in this conversation. I know that already. And then can you give a little overview of salvia?
Sure. Yeah, salvia is a really, really interesting drug. Salvia is the plant. Diviner's sage is, the common English term. But it's used in Central America a bit, South America, but generally used orally. People chew the leaves, which is a much different experience. Smoking it is, kind of this new world, you know, I think primarily West Coast. I mean, it was definitely all across the US. And I don't really know how far it got into Europe, but anyways, when you smoke it, it's a 5 minute experience that is often called like DMT's really weird cousin, or strange uncle. In that DMT is a structured 5 minute experience, right? For most people, There's like a beginning and an end. And, there's like a story to it. Like you had this experience, there was this tunnel and maybe you met elves or entities or what have you. Salvia, like some of the typical experiences that people report are they become furniture. A lot of people are just like, yeah, I felt like I was a bench for 5 minutes. Like and people around them will report, yes, this person, all they said for 5 minutes was like, I am a bench. I am a bench. Like, and they come out of it and they're just like, yeah, I don't know. That was the weirdest thing that I've ever
Wow.
experienced. Um, or some other reports or people are like, people talk of this zipper world effect where they see the world unzippering and it's like often explicitly zippers and they're
Wow.
just slowly or quickly unzipping in multiple directions, like pulling reality apart. Um, and it's weird in all kinds of ways, like the neurochemistry of it, the compound itself in the world of drugs. I mean, again, if you're interested, I can rabbit hole into any of these aspects, but
Sure. Fascinating. I personally have not had experience with salvia. So that's uh I'm not sure that I'm looking to become a bench anytime soon or experience life for 5 minutes, but who knows what the future holds.
it
All right,
is
so
fascinating,
it
very
seems
fascinating.
sounds like it. All right, so we're high school land. You've got cannabis, salvia, which obviously are two major different experiences in and of themselves. In knowing you, I've heard you reference your fascination and intrigue with the cannabinoids and how they fire different parts of the brain. I think you've even gone into more scientific approaches to study within a group context. But maybe that's jumping down the path. So we'll circle back to that. So here you are now, 19 in your early 20s. LSD's been on board. You've done significant work with psilocybin, and I mean, can you expound on your own interest in, yes, meeting this friend of yours who's talking to you about the scientific impacts or the biological chemical impacts that these compounds are having in the brain. But I make up anyway, but I guess the question for you is were you a outlier? Were you, was this pretty unique? Were you around other people that were diving in and doing these heroic journeys with medicines or
Um, Definitely, there was no one really pushing limits in my social circles like I was. Psychonauts were not rare in my world. I was always attracted to psychonaut communities, right? Just generally, people who were interested in psychedelics. Yeah, still often in a recreational context, in festivals or what have you. But people who would do that, but also take a more serious consideration and do intentional work, whether it was for the purposes of healing or the purposes of exploration, right? And people who are doing it particularly for the reason of exploration were always appealing, because that's been my primary interest in it. There was definitely, a significant healing process, especially with psilocybin, early on. Just coming out of childhood, you pick up certain traumas regardless. And my household was not. I had a good childhood overall, but you don't get out unscathed. So fortunately, I didn't have a ton of work, a ton of trauma to resolve. But there was certainly a healing process early on. But I got through it quick enough that exploration was for a majority of my early 20s my main goal, my main interest. So people
beautiful?
who also shared that, I was always attracted to them. But yeah, I didn't really find serious psychonauts who took it as seriously as I did, um, until later, probably more closer to my mid 20s.
Got it. And so then you were sharing about in your 20s dropping out of college, but then finding this triple PhD, and you mentioned mentors plural. So you're finding yourself in these scholarly, having scholarly mentors that are, sounds to me like they're into psychedelics, that they're psychonauts themselves. Would that be accurate?
My first mentor in the world of cannabinoids, we just never really discussed I mean, I'm sure he did psychedelics like back. I mean, he was old. When
Right.
I was working with him, he was like 70. I think I started working with him, he was 73 or 74. Um, so yeah, as far as I could tell, he didn't talk about them, so I don't really know. But later, yes, later my mentors were psychedelic friendly.
Got it.
Um, yeah.
Beautiful. And so were these, when you're doing these explorations and you're starting to find yourself meeting other psychonauts that are interested in healing or expanding consciousness and having these expansive experiences, was this in a, I mean, you mentioned festivals, but would this be in a group setting, in a ceremonial setting, in a social setting, or all the above?
Yeah, my personal explorations, all of the above.
I gotcha.
I've pretty much done a psychedelic in almost any context you can think
Right.
of.
Okay. Um, which I do hope we get into some of the just the discussion about the either the legalization and what's happening in our society, and more on that in a bit. I would like to circle back to just something that I've known about you that has really stood out whenever I talk to a friend or an acquaintance about Cody Gibbons. Um, the one of the main things that sticks out to me is your passion to alleviate mental health suffering on the planet. And you've already alluded to that with the healing, and you found these people that were they're both interested in these compounds, but also interested in the healing potential that these compounds provide. Where did that, was that, maybe you've already alluded to it, but were you, was that always a passion of yours? Was that always of interest of yours? Um, Suffering? I mean, where did that birth and come about?
I think from a just childhood developmental standpoint, it primarily comes from being the oldest child of six children, which I think gave me a sense of, a strong sense of responsibility. And in my teens, I found these concepts that resonated with me. Altruism and utilitarianism is essentially what they boiled down to. And it, yeah, I'm not sure exactly if there was any catalyzing point that made me feel that my core objective in life is to reduce suffering. For me, it just seems like if you get to a certain point in your own developmental path, the obvious progression is to say, well, I'm pretty healthy. Like I feel good. I'm generally happy. What else is there to do besides go out into the world and like try to make it better for other people? Because I mean, there's so honestly, it's incredibly selfish. I have an incredibly selfish desire to live in a world without suffering. My paradise is walking through the streets and everyone is happy, right? So there's like a sense of responsibility associated, but there's also just this, inherently selfish desire, which you could construe as selfless, that I just, I don't want people to suffer around me. And it's not good enough to just be in a community that's not suffering. Like I need to be able to travel the world. I need to be able to go into all communities and everyone be happy. Not to say that, I don't see really a world ever where it's just there's no suffering at all, unless maybe we can teach from the womb how to transcend valence. But it's gonna be a real long time. There's always gonna be suffering, but they're just yeah, for me, there's just too much existential dread in the
Right.
world. And I'm tired of it. We gotta fix it.
Well, beautiful. I, for one, as with many others, are grateful you're on that path. I mean, the phrase, and maybe this does or doesn't apply, but with my Christian background, um, I started to think a lot about heaven and people's desire to go to heaven and be in this heavenly realm, and that the phrase selfish righteousness came about. Um, and as you were talking about the selfishly, you want to see suffering, but I see both sides or two sides of that coin because I do think I hear you loud and clear, but I also think it's a very unique calling that you carry, or a unique. I don't. I have not. I've met a lot of people in my life, but I've not met somebody that is as committed to that, or even has that awareness of what might it be like if I could travel anywhere in the world and suffering on the planet was eliminated. How good would that be? And that is, heaven on earth. So I think it's beautiful, and I'm glad you're committed to it. The book "The Road Less Traveled" by Dr. Scott Peck. He starts the book with the opening line of "Life is difficult." So we all face these challenges, and this is a psychological book about, I mean, one could argue suffering at the core, and I hear that theme, that life just throws challenges our way. And it will be fascinating to continue to witness. It feels to me I believe that there was a time where you shared with me that even if you could see suffering across the board reduced even a little bit, what might that look like pervasively on the planet, or something to that extent? So that
Sure.
really resonates. So where are you at these days with that, or what gets you most excited in regards to the propensity or the potential of alleviating suffering?
Yeah. Oh boy. Well, I'm excited by a lot of things. As you alluded to, I do have a strong interest in what I've generally called neurosociology, um, trying to understand mechanisms of behavior, especially mechanisms of transformational experience, and how that results in progression of self-development, and um, characterizing how those changes result in community changes and how those community changes result in sociological changes. Yeah, with the underlying premise that if you increase the standard of mental health across the board, you will reduce global suffering, by more than by helping a single community or a single person. And so, I mean, that's just the utilitarian perspective I've always taken. And so trying to characterize these relationships is a really big challenge. Um, Understanding first it requires a lot of consciousness research, which is, extremely expensive, and underfunded.
Hmm.
But you have to do that to understand mechanisms of behavior and experience. And so that's kind of where the birthplace of Sensoria started, was this interest in neurosociology and what it would take.
Is that a term? Sorry to interrupt, but is that a term that you coined?
Um,
Neurosociology?
I'm certainly not the first person to use it.
Okay.
It's not. It's it's definitely a very, very small field of people
Uh-huh.
that focus on characterizing these relationships. They probably generally put themselves more under the label of civilization engineers or paradise engineers.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, it's not a novel concept. I
Right.
have, I think, proposed some novelty in how what that process looks like of characterizing these relationships. Um, but yeah, I'm not the first person to, think about this and work on this idea.
Got it. So you mentioned Sensoria, which is definitely something we do want to dive into, and I'm excited to hear more about that. So uh, say the phrase again, neurosociology,
Hmm.
and expound on that, and then if you can segue into sharing a little bit about Sensoria, because you has been mentioned, and then yeah, what that's about and where you see that going.
Sure. Yeah. Um, so for example, something that is on the forefront of my priority projects is building these social dynamic experiments based on neurophenomenology coming from entactogens or empathogens. Really substances across the board because there's this unique bonding effect that happens between people who do psychedelics together that is very notable for the sake of building social cohesion within sociological systems, right? Within communities, whether it's a company, a nonprofit, a book club, right? Just any sort of generalized community. If you want to strengthen it, and if you want to, and I'll give up something that is sometimes a little controversial in the world of trying to run a sustainable business. But ideally, we can build communities that don't act on capitalistic need, right? Ideally, we can sort of transcend some of the negative aspects of capitalism um, by virtue of creating communities that are notably passionate and bonded together. Essentially, if everyone really loves each other, you don't really need money, right? Like people will do things for the people they love.
Hmm.
And so there's social dynamics around this and social, especially social bonding dynamics that can be characterized and eventually consensually utilized. So for example, we're looking at legal jurisdictions to conduct experiments with some notable substances that fall into these categories of interesting social dynamic enhancements or social cohesion enhancements, um, like MDMA, right? That's the one that everyone's going to be familiar with. MDMA creates a bond between people, and it's very powerful. I think most people that have taken MDMA would agree. I mean, it's reported often, right? It saves marriages all the time. It starts relationships all the time that, often peter out because, frankly, you weren't supposed to get together, but you did some MDMA together and you really loved each other. And, now you're in this awkward 2 week, I don't actually want to do this. So it happens all the time. Um, And there's these other substances, for example, 3-MMC is probably the next most popular, um, that also has these MDMA-like qualities, but simply with different dynamics. Uh, and then there's also this other one, 5-MAPB, which is a benzofuran. And oh, sorry, let me turn that. Don't know why that's happening.
And for the listeners' sake, including mine,
Hmm.
if when you say 3-MMC and then the other compound, are these newer developed? entheogens? Are they derived naturally? Where are these? Can you expound a little bit on, not to derail you too much?
Yeah, they're both all, as far as I know, always synthetic. I don't know if either of them are naturally occurring.
Okay.
They're not particularly exotic or complex compounds, which in my experience means that it's very possible they occur in nature, places. For example, like ketamine was thought to be only synthetic for a long time, and then they did find a plant that naturally produces ketamine, in extremely small amounts. It's like not logistically, you know, relevant for any reason. No one's going to get organic plant extracted ketamine. But they found a little bit in a plant somewhere. So in both these cases, so like 3-MMC comes from cathinone, which is from the cot plant. So if they found some breed of cot plant that had 3-MMC in it, I wouldn't be surprised at all.
Right.
Um, so yeah, while we might not know of them naturally occurring, I'm generally against the bias of naturally occurring being advantageous in any way, right? If a
Mm.
human makes it, the natural creature made it just like a plant. Um, and so yeah, in that context, it's like even if you do believe there is a spirit there or a reason there to care, again, I wouldn't be surprised if they were naturally occurring.
So 3-MMC is similar to that of MDMA, and was it synthetically, did it originate here more recently?
I don't know when exactly it was synthesized. It's not
Okay.
new. Like it's at
Okay.
least 30, 40, 50 years old.
Got it.
Um, so it could be relatively new depending on how you construe the age of other drugs.
Got it.
Right? MDMA was technically synthesized in 1920 something, but then wasn't used until the 70s. So
Right. Which circling back to one of the things that you are on with this social connection and the social healing, and you mentioned something that I'm very intrigued by, that if we were all loving each other, I think you even said that money wouldn't be an issue or necessary. Um,
yeah, I mean, there's already communities that live without money. It's like
right.
not, it's like not a super exotic concept. I mean, for most people live in the urban rat race, it
Yeah.
seems impossible. But there's plenty of communities out there that do it. The problem is they're really hard to expand because we break down into our basic tribalistic biostructures, right? Our biocultural structures. And why is that? Why can't we effectively expand sociological systems to a grander scale? And I think the answer to that is we just simply don't understand the mechanisms of our bonding, right? We don't understand how we
Mm,
relate to people at a neurological level. We don't
mm,
understand compassion and empathy and sympathy and all of that. And if we did, we could utilize that knowledge to help ourselves love each other, right? It's
hmm.
like if you understand how to bolster those relationships, I mean, it only brings more quality to life. I mean, there's
Right.
always the age-old adages of like, what matters to people at the end of their life? It was relationships.
Right.
So if you can just strengthen everyone's relationships and improve their ability to expand their social circles with deep, deep bonds, yeah, money just seems kind of silly after a while.
Right. Right. And I do think about and I know the Shulgins and their work is really near and dear to your heart. Uh, and as you were talking about the connection sociologically or amongst groups, I did think about them immediately of my limited awareness of them working with MDMA in particular amongst a group or communal setting on a more regimented basis. Is
Hmm. Yeah.
that that accurate? So, all right. So you were talking about MDMA, 3-MMC. There was another compound,
5 MAPB.
Five
MAPP.
5MAPP.
B, B as in boy.
Right.
Map B.
Map B.
Map B,
Uh,
some people call
all right. And utilizing these in and amongst these sociological for the purpose of an empowered sociological outcome. You've also mentioned the lack of the study of how we connect with each other. And I find that to be fascinating. And so as we talk about or explore sensoria or again share that, it feels like you were, going more in that direction as to because that seems to be the connection of where sensoria has come about. And so yeah, I would love to. I derailed you a little bit on the compounds because those were new to me. So it's fascinating for me, from my perspective, to be around a guy like you when I'm realizing that there are far more compounds. My entheogenic list is
it.
relatively short, and then you introduce me to another, I don't know, 40 or 50 that I have no awareness or knowledge of. So um, but yeah, are you open to sharing a little bit more in that sociological construct and what sensoria is and yeah, what is coming down or coming together with sensoria?
Sure. Yeah. I'll go into the practical aspects of sensoria because I could certainly do a deep dive on what it is, sort of metaphysically, if you will. Um, so I've been obsessed with neurophenomenology for a long time, and for those who are listening and don't know, neurophenomenology is essentially looking at the brain and trying to understand patterns between what people report in their experience, generally verbally, though not necessarily, and how that relates to what's happening in the brain. So the study of phenomenology generally is just what is our conscious experience and how can we construct that into language or any sort of expression, right? We are generally trying to move into generalized expressions of phenomenology, meaning that your motion or your facial expressions can convey notable data, right? And that there's a phenomenology of just understanding the what facial expressions are and what movements mean in terms of conveying how you're feeling. Um, so there's a whole broad, that's a whole broad field. Um, but yeah, Sensoria is really particularly interested in it's a research organization that I started because I'm very interested in neurophenomenology. Um, so kind of the first challenge of neurophenomenology is really getting a lot of data because it's not easy to understand what's happening in the brain and find its corresponding causes or effects in conscious experience. So the yeah, Sensoria's main purpose is to try and overcome this obstacle. How do we incentivize more people to want to come and contribute neurophenomenology data, have an experience, tell us what the experience was like, and allow us to understand what is causing that experience? And Sensoria will do that in various ways. So we will often throw events, which is our incentive mechanism to gather people. And so at these events, we invite people. There's an entertainment aspect that is like the true incentive for people generally. Although there are plenty of people who are just interested in the contributing to a project such as this. But really, people like to come hang out and they like somewhere to talk about cool things with cool people. So Sensoria invites people to an event, and we try to conduct consciousness research experiences at the event. Sometimes, depending on the jurisdiction of the event, it will be relatively simple, could be breath work and EEG headsets. Although we are particularly interested in utilizing legal psychoactive compounds in jurisdictions that we can to try and understand kind of a new facet of neurophenomenology that is unexplored in the field. So traditionally, when academics talk about neurophenomenology, they are referencing some sort of EEG or fMRI study, right? Those are the traditional neuroimaging methods. And that's kind of our best approach, or it's traditionally been the best approach to try to look for patterns between that activity and what people are describing of their experience. But we're really interested in understanding the receptor neurochemistry space, right? What is a drug interacting with at the receptor level in the brain? And what does that receptor correspond to in terms of the experience that you're having? So there's this whole kind of, it's not exactly neuroimaging, but it's sort of this neuro documentation of looking at patterns between this receptor activity and these experiences, tying this all together and organizing it in such a way that we can add a significant data set to neurophenomenology in general and start to create, models of consciousness that integrate both neurophenomenological studies with EEG and fMRI, but also with this new aspect of understanding the brain and how drugs are working, how they're corresponding to certain effects. So what this looks like practically at an event is as an attendant or participant, you come and you essentially start the event with kind of like a pseudo clinical trial, if you will. It's not quite as boring, though we try to neutralize most variables. And we very much believe in this real world data aspect of this. So while these are not in a lab, some would argue that the data is not very good. But generally, we would argue that real world data is more reflective of people's conscious experiences than giving them something and putting them in an fMRI machine. Right? That's just that is an aspect of conscious experience, undoubtedly. Not to say that that's not incredibly valuable, but to think that that's going to give us any kind of comprehensive understanding of consciousness or the mechanisms within it, I think is pretty myopic and absurd. So we believe that we can neutralize enough variables at an event to invite someone in and try a psychoactive compound. So like in the past, for example, we've used a blue lotus extract, which is a mild euphoric social buzz for some people. It's not very intoxicating. There's not much danger with administering at events. There's all kinds of it's a very common tea, blue lotus tea, that is often served in concentrated forms at gatherings all over the country, primarily on the West Coast, but all over the country. It's just a nice chilling effect. But it's an example of a legal psychoactive that is uncontrolled in any way as far as we can tell, and we can freely administer it and collect data, which is very, very valuable. And Sensoria plans to, as more and more psychoactive compounds enter the market, whether it's through decriminalization of already psychoactive compounds or through the production of novel molecules that are not scheduled yet. We're looking for this balance of compounds that are known to be safe and known to have really any psychoactive effect. And so you might come to an event and try it. And for example, with those experiments, one of the notable qualities that we've gathered from the experiential reports is that there's a significant amount of people who report that there's something with the compounds that induce a dreamy effect, in that people feel like they're dreaming, which is kind of a peculiar quality to have as part of induced conscious experience.
Hmm.
Um, and so an example of even though it's not a particularly exciting thing to look at through most people's eyes, there is value in pretty much any psychoactive in its variability of effects. And so the main two compounds in Blue Lotus are nuciferine and apomorphine. So essentially what we want to do is look at what those compounds are doing in the brain and then gather as many experience reports
Hmm.
from as many people as we can and try to understand what exactly is causing what or what patterns there are to activity at a certain receptor and potentially these experiences people are having. So that kind of gives you, I think, the general idea of how it is that we would do consciousness research at an event, from a very high level. And there's, all kinds of subset of experiments that can be done in this framework, right? You can take legal enantiomers, right, like left and right-handed molecules, and take those separately and do a blind test. This is something we're trying to do legally with ketamine through some ketamine clinic partners, where we do a study and seeing if people can uh, differentiate between the R isomer and the S isomer, blindly, and also
Mm.
try to characterize those effects because it's pretty much completely unexplored in the literature how the different isomers create different psychoactive effects. So
Mm.
there's a lot of work that can be done just characterizing what the differences are amongst the population and how consistent those are. And that gives us a lot of information on the sort of population level understanding of what kind of receptors are expressed or what kind of receptors might correspond to what kind of experiences. So I could rabbit hole all day on
Right.
the potential we could do, but yeah, there's
So, so I know there's an event coming up with Sensoria, but are you able to elaborate a little more on how you're actually collecting the data? I mean, I hear the trip report and the testimony being captured, but how are you
Mhm.
actually getting the neurological uh, data? I mean, you mentioned EKGs, like
Yeah, so the EEG is just kind of the easy one.
EEG, sorry.
Yeah, because you can, they have the EEG headsets, the consumer grade ones have just improved so vastly in the last 5 years or so, that you can actually get reliable data with fairly affordable headsets that you can kind of just
Okay.
put on people at events, and do some basic experimental design around the environment, and those are relatively easy. Trip reports are, as you mentioned, another way, and essentially we gather that data set and look at, and when I say us, we have research partners that do this, that look at the neurochemistry, right? So they conduct a bunch of tests where they are testing receptors or testing compounds against receptors to understand what the affinity is, right? How much does the receptor interact, or sorry, how much does the compound interact with the receptor and like fit into the keyhole, if you
Hmm.
will? What is the strength? What is the profile of receptors that it interacts with? Which ones does it interact with the most? Which ones does it interact with the least? Right. So this is a receptor profile that you can then compare to the experience reports to then try to understand, like across many compounds and many experiences, which receptors might be implicated in certain experiences.
And this is being tracked by the EEG, the headset?
No, no, no. It's the EEG is only looking at electrical activity.
Okay.
Um,
So how are
that
you getting that
information
refined? Yeah.
that information comes from essentially these experiments where they create these receptor protein populations, if you will. So they take um, there's a couple ways it's done now. So it's done both in a way that they just take the receptor protein, like in a petri dish, type
Mhm.
environment, and then they just put the molecule in the solution
Oh,
and
okay.
they just
All
see
right.
how much it binds. Has,
I see.
has nothing to do, there's no in-person,
Right.
analysis of what's exactly happening in your brain. We just have an idea of what receptors you have in your brain.
Right.
And then we have an idea of what receptors are interacted with because of this binding effect.
Right.
So, and they also do like stem cell, like there's also personalized stuff where they can take one of your stem cells and find which receptors it exhibits, and then they could put a drug in the solution and see if it's doing anything with like any weird receptors or.
Got it. So Sensoria is a nonprofit.
Yeah, there's two legal structures that one is a nonprofit and I think one will be a public benefit. So there's Sensoria events, which I think will be a public benefit, and Sensoria research which will be the nonprofit.
I see. Huh, beautiful. So, and then this brainchild has been clearly this has been a theme for your life, since teenage, if not before. Um, um, your passion, your interest, your, if you will, a zone of genius. I mean, to me, it's quite fascinating, this path you've been on. So how long has Sensoria been around? And then can you then go into what can be expected and potentially ways in which a viewer here or listener could get involved?
Sure. Yeah. Um, Sensoria formally started with our first event, um, which I hosted to try and help the Shulgin farm raise money. The Shulgin legacy is very core to my heart, as you alluded to earlier, because I very much believe that Alexander Shulgin and his wife Anne were the mother and father of contemporary psychonautics, right? They really went so far in terms of exploring ways to document well and try to understand the difference between molecules and experiences, and try to map the breadth of experience through their documentations and trip reports. And um, yeah, that we are at the core a psychonaut organization, right? We are about exploring consciousness in any way that we can legally. And yeah, so anyways, the first event was a fundraiser for them, um, which was very, very special for me, and I think very special for the company. And so they'll be an ongoing partner, but that was December of 23. So it's been 15 months since the event. I've been working on it, you know, for years. I mean, 3 or 4 years. Um, seriously working on it, building documentation out, building a pitch deck to, initially I was going to try and raise money through equity, through an equity sale of some kind to get the event started. And um, yeah, so I'd say about 4 years pretty seriously.
Beautiful. And then
And
what's, yeah.
yeah, how to get involved. Yeah, so our website is sensoria.events. There's some information on us there for people who are interested. There's a community page that links to our Discord and our Patreon, which is a really easy way to, very affordably support us. And, other than that, come to our events. Participate in the research is really what we want people to do. And we're trying to decentralize the events a bit and create chapters in major cities so that most people can get to an event relatively easily. So, other than that, reach out directly. There's a way on the webpage if you are an academic researcher or a patron who, wants to make a more significant donation than what the Patreon allows. That is obviously very welcomed. And you can email us through the site, or, info@sensoria.events or Cody@sensoria.events. Yeah, and otherwise, I mean, if you're an events person, you know, anybody with any skills that wants to contribute, that an event or an endeavor like this that, you know, has a long form dedication to trying to improve mental health through a method that, frankly, I think is quite enjoyable for most people. Um, so yeah, again, visit the website and let us know how we can help you, and maybe you can help us too.
Beautiful. We'll come into a landing here in the near future, but are you, can you elaborate a little bit more? You mentioned just a moment ago legally, and I feel like this is a bit of a gray area, and one that for those of us that are in the entheogenic or approaching these medicines and compounds with a level of reverence and respect. So from my perspective, um, there's definitely a deep spiritual component and aspect. Um, for you, there's, I believe that to be true as well, the sociological, the spiritual, the connection with community, but then also a very heavy emphasis on the scientific, which I'm quite enamored with. And again, glad there's people like yourself at the helm, with your brain, your genius, zone of genius. But are you able to elaborate, or where do you see things? I mean, what when you're hosting these events, is it always geared towards compounds or utilizing compounds that are legal in that state or region? Um, are there loopholes, or is there more freedom, if you will, to be able to utilize these because of the loosening up, if you will? I mean, it feels, I'm not the only one that's saying that we're in the midst of a psychedelic renaissance. Um, it was mentioned in a thread we're on that Oprah Winfrey just came out hosting a podcast with Michael Pollan. Um, and so, yeah, are you able to speak into the legalization piece and what you see and what you experience, and then also how Sensoria adopts itself around that?
Sure. Yeah. Um, yeah, I mean, obviously, Sensoria as a legal entity has the basic limitations of we can't take any serious legal risks. Um, you know, we are interested in exploring what we consider pretty mild legal risks. For example, like doing a THC event in California. Right? Obviously, the state's, you know, never going to mind, but you know, if we were to draw some notable attention, could the DEA come and give us a problem? Yeah, and we generally want to avoid that. So we're definitely looking for lawyers. There's, you know, ever any lawyers that want to join the legal team. We are trying to understand that risk landscape, and generally just very excited about the way the legal landscape is changing. So Sensoria obviously supports decriminalization. Um, I mean, I can't speak for Sensoria as a whole because we're quite a group now. But personally, I'm against criminalization of substances in general. But Sensoria as a research institution is enamored with the idea of having more tools, right? And we never want to leave the personability or the compassion out of the science or out of the experience, right? So it's not just that these things are tools, but most of the illegal things, and you know, there's definitely exceptions. There's drugs that most of us know is um, well, there's sometimes there's politics around psychedelic exceptionalism. Um, I'm sometimes hesitant to admit that I am a psychedelic exceptionalist because of those reasons. But I do think it's a very, very hard argument to say that some substances are not safer than others. I mean, as a scientist, from a pure toxicological standpoint, I think most of the field would agree that there's clear gradients there, um, and clear advantages to certain compounds. Um, and so, yeah, in general, Sensoria is interested in these things as tools because I think that most of them can be utilized safely. I think that a lot of people use these psychedelic tools right now, probably way more than what most of us even think. And it doesn't cause many problems. Not to say that, you know, psychedelics don't cause psychotic breaks or, these events do happen, but they are rare enough that I think that we can create responsible research containers out in the wild. Um, and so we are definitely going to be on the forefront of any significant decriminalization or legalization if that happens anytime in the near future, especially in the US. Right now, we are looking at utilizing substances that are not regulated in countries, right? So the legal landscape is pretty varied. Um, the most obvious example is simply that some countries have analog laws, some don't. Countries without analog laws gives us a lot of room to conduct a lot of research. So while most of the interesting research that we want to conduct might not happen in the United States for a long time, we are working to understand legal landscapes in other countries to be able to host, hopefully somewhat large scale events that allow us to produce a lot of data on this, consciousness mapping process that we're getting into. Um, Yeah, so again, always supportive of decriminalization efforts.
Hmm.
And I think that again, as long as things are done safely, I think that the more research tools at our disposal, the better we can unlock leverage points for mental health research.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Well, Cody, this has been on a personal level, this has just been incredibly enjoyable, and I trust that for the viewer, the listener, that there is some incredible information that you've just shared, and I feel like we could go down many, many more rabbit holes or dive down some of these different veins or topics for a lot longer of a time. So in that respect, I do hope to have you back on the show. Um, and continue the discussion. And in the meantime, as Cody mentioned, if you have any questions or want to get more information, you can visit sensoria.events for the website, and he can be reached at, thank you for sharing your email, Cody at sensoria.events. That's the email.
Yep, correct.
Beautiful. And then as we're wrapping up here today, and I'm not trying to have the last word, but one of the things, as you were talking about the decriminalization and just the forward momentum or this notion of the psychedelic renaissance, um, that is commonly referenced. I think even Oprah mentioned that. Um, I think back to the 60s and the Nixon era and all this hype and pomp and circumstance around psychedelics and that word, and it's carried such for many, it's carried a very negative connotation, has been associated. So as a guy that was a former Christian pastor, and then now into working with entheogens for my healing and advancement, I certainly have come across my fair share of critics. And then it's you know it's it we'll never know, but I'm excited that there's all this momentum, because what I was going to say is that in that 60s with the Nixons and the Reagans of the world, that all this putting to really stunting the research that was already on its way. It's exciting to see the amount of research, the amount of the number of universities like your Johns Hopkins of the world that are popping up around the world, and people studying these compounds. And I'm excited. I like how you're talking about research in the wild. I think that that's a major differentiator with Sensoria, and something that really has been birthed in and through you, my friend, and I'm thrilled to be a part of the journey and witnessing with some bit of a close to front row seat, if you will. It's super exciting, and especially as an individual that, at the core, I would say at the core of my own life, yes, spirituality is really near and dear. Um, but then also in that mental health journey that I've been on, that notion of alleviating the mental health suffering is just so deep and near to my heart, and I'm excited to see what this research will birth to really impact humanity in a good way. And as if I had it correct, you alluded to in a previous discussion we had, like what would it look like? What would the impact look like if indeed we saw a reduction in the amount of suffering, mental health suffering in this context on the planet? What might that look like? And how wonderful will it be to travel on around the world and go to any place on the planet and see people happy? That is truly heaven on earth. So, to that end, I remain committed and see you just on the forefront. So I'm so grateful. I did not mention on the front end, but our paths crossed on the playa at Burning Man. It was my first time ever attending Burning Man, which was something I was intrigued to do. And so grateful our paths crossed that day. I don't always whip out a phone and take a selfie, but within minutes of meeting you, I did. So something I treasure. So again, celebrating our paths have crossed. Anything you would like to share or reflect as we wrap up here today?
No, I think that's about it. I just want to thank you and share my own gratitude for your kind words and for anyone out there who appreciates this message and is interested enough to check us out. So grateful
Awesome.
for everyone.
Awesome, Cody. Thank you so much for your time today, my friend. And yeah, do check us out at Psychedelic Scene Magazine. It's on uh, Instagram, Facebook. We have over 20,000 followers on Facebook. So if there's any way we can be of support to you and your journey, please let us know. And if you have any requests for upcoming podcasts, I would love to hear from you. You can reach me at dr.matthewgamble@gmail.com. Peace and blessings on the journey, my friends.